no one's more of an environmentalist than a geologist because they understand the earth, how it got here, and they spend their days looking at rocks and sand deposits and everything else that pertains to the earth itself, and they care deeply about it. So to have this word environmentalist become topic of division, it's just absurd.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode number 5 of the Rose Bros podcast. I'm your host, Trevor Rose. Centered around a cup of Rose Bros coffee, my goal is to share the stories and life lessons of other entrepreneurs, athletes, and interesting people in general. Today, we are joined by Terry Etam, a 25-year veteran of the energy industry who is an accountant by training but has had a variety of experience in production, trading, storage, and energy transportation. Terry is currently an energy executive at an exploration and development company headquartered in Calgary, Alberta, and is the best-selling author of The End of Fossil Fuel Insanity, a book that explores the practical realities of energy consumption in the modern world. The book is an insightful look into the past, present, and future of the energy industry as it explores the debates and topics of the modern times. Terry has written for more than 5 years on his own website, Public Energy Number 1, and is also a widely read columnist for the largest Canadian energy news website, theborereport.com. He has been called an industry thought leader and is one of the most influential voices in the energy industry. Terry and I talked about many things, including the false narrative of industry versus the environment, the problem of harmful ideologues on both sides of the debate, and how a pragmatic viewpoint is currently missing from the discussion. I hope you enjoyed the show. Terry, thanks for sitting down. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. You're welcome. Second time today. Did another podcast earlier today.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Who was with that with?
For a media site in the United States. They like to hear about what's happening in the Canadian energy sector from a Canadian perspective. So I talk to them every couple months. So
interesting. Well, I hope I can keep up with you. You're probably 10 times smarter than me than most of this stuff. So I hope I can
I'm just older.
Hold my own. So where are we at in the energy industry these days? Can you give us your take on Canadian energy?
Not very good, not for Canadian energy. The forces against it are pretty huge. Market access is a big problem. We can't get world prices for oil or natural gas. We're forced to sell our product into the center of the North American continent. That's where the pipelines flow. To the extent we can even get pipelines built there. Some cross-border ones we can't get built, like Keystone XL. So we're forced into a glutted United States market. So the prices are just discounted back to Canada. So when you have only one customer, it's not a good place to be. On top of that is the climate change movement, where the demonization of hydrocarbons is universal. Everyone from children up to senior citizens now regards petroleum as planet-destroying substance, which depends on your perspective. People that provide it see it as a life-giving substance, and I'm of that opinion too. You can't heat buildings without it, and we can't live without it. And I understand why people want to live in a cleaner, greener world, and that makes total sense, but you can't run before you walk. You have to. We need a measured pace to get there, and that seems to have escaped a lot of people for ourselves. So
you started as an accountant, and what was your entry into the energy industry, just for people listening?
Going back there. Yeah. So I'm from Saskatchewan, and at the time I graduated from university, there were no jobs in Saskatchewan. Almost my entire graduating class moved to Alberta, or to Calgary specifically.
It was the land of opportunity.
It was. Well, if I wanted to stay in Saskatoon or Saskatchewan, I would have had to graduate and look for a job, and there were no jobs that I was aware of.
Right.
And I had 2 or 3 standing job offers in Calgary from the oil patch.
At the time.
For way more money than I would have made in Saskatchewan
as an accountant.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was sort of a no-brainer. You come out of university and do you want to look for a job for an indefinite period of time and take whatever you get, or do you just take one of these
move to Alberta
fantastic jobs? Yeah, that pays quite well.
A lot of opportunity.
Yeah. The energy industry is so dynamic, it's hard to leave it. It's because it's so fast-paced and it's challenging, and it can be rewarding for sure. And it's up until the past couple of years, it's been a great place to be. And then till the mood is turned.
So you came out west, came to Calgary.
Came to Calgary, and then I started with one of the super majors where you get trained well, and stuck with them for a few years. And they were too big for me, so then I moved to a sequence of smaller companies. And as you move to smaller companies, you can take on more and more responsibility and learn more too, so a broader scope of things.
Diverse set of roles, which is giving you a lot of insights into different parts of the energy industry.
I would say so, yeah. The size, organizational scope learning there too. So you're right. On the producer side, I learned a lot working at a super major, how they work and their processes and the size of them, which is hard to grasp, and the international nature. Then when you work for a junior, it's raw, you're on the edge, right? And you know what sort of environmental approval you might need for a pipeline, and you know ducks are involved or beavers or something, and you learn that side of it, and you learn about drilling, you learn about marketing of products, you learn a lot in a junior companies.
So
it's very dynamic. So
you've had a lot of different insights in the industry.
I think so, yeah.
Which has kind of led up to your...
It really helped with writing, because kind of I feel like I have a pretty wide scope on the energy sector.
Right.
From the time it's searched for through exploration and even seismic, right up until produced and goes to refinery or a gas processing facility, and then ultimate consumption.
So for people who haven't heard Terry, he's not just someone who's come out of left field. He's seen pretty much every size of company in the industry, and also had a lot of insights into various roles in the industry. One thing that sticks out for me after reading Terry's book, one quote in particular at the start of the book, and that goes, "Out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there." That really represents, I think, Terry's view of a pragmatic, centrist, not crazy idealist on either end of the spectrum.
I'm glad you picked up on that. And it's a quote I stole from some long dead author, but I thought it fit the book perfectly, that we become so hung up and polarized now that as soon as topic of petroleum or even energy comes up, it's which camp are you in? Are you a climate change believer, or are you a denier? And you're forced to pick. There's so much baggage that comes with either side. You attach all sorts of labels by taking a position on any one thing. And that quote was important to me in the book. You're saying we need to park that stuff if we want to make any progress in terms of greening the planet or caring for the environment, which I think is what the core of the whole. I think climate change is even a bad phrase now. It's become too politicized, and I would love to park it, just like I would like to park fossil fuels, and just forget that, and let's just talk about energy requirements and how do we get to where we want to be in the most efficient way possible, given the constraints that we all live in, that no one will give up their way of life. No North American will, or European. Half the world's population, or 2/3, is trying to get where we are. So those are the realities. And how do you deny people in India the right to live like we do? When they become middle class, or China, that's 3 billion people, 2.7 in those two countries right there. As they become middle class, they want to fly around the world. They want to see the pyramids in Egypt, or they want to drive to the Grand Canyon, and who are we to say they can't do that? So I think those are the big forces that are sort of givens from a humanitarian perspective, or a pragmatic perspective, as you put it, exactly right. Those are the ones we need to deal with, rather than saying we need to stop using this fuel type immediately, which is just practically impossible. Tried to bring a centrist view to it, tried to be respectful of the causes that have brought these two viewpoints to the fore. Not necessarily respectful of everything that makes up those viewpoints, because there's a lot of fanaticism on either side, which I don't have time for. So,
well, that's what it seems to have become. Is this: you're either in the left or the right. You either hate the environment, you're in the fossil fuel industry, or you are an environmentalist tree hugger.
Right. If you think about even that, the word environmentalism, it's become an absurd word now, because we hear one group, the climate change group, which has laid claim to the term environmentalist, and then you have old school fossil fuel industry, which takes aim at environmentalists, because that's the label that the climate change side has adopted. And fossil fuel people, and I don't even like the term fossil fuels, so I'm going to use hydrocarbons. Right. That industry is made up of people who are as environmental as anyone, and no one's more of an environmentalist than a geologist, because they understand the earth, how it got here, and they spend their days looking at rocks and sand deposits and everything else that pertains to the earth itself, and they care deeply about it. So to have this word environmentalist become topic of division, it's just absurd, but that's what it's become. And the environment is what we should be worried about. And then climate change, people have their own agenda, and business people have their own agenda, and we need to park those and say we need to keep 7 billion people alive from a humanitarian perspective. I don't think anybody wants to wipe out half of them or 3/4 or whatever. So how are we going to do that? And we need to find a path to do that in the most efficient way to limit our footprint. At the same time, realizing that 7 billion people have an enormous footprint.
How much do you think of that conscientious awareness of the environment exists in energy industry?
As far as the people viewing themselves as environmentalists?
Well, not necessarily environmentalists, but the fact that they're not ignoring the environment. They work in the energy industry, but they care about the environment.
It's a bit of a paradox because that message never gets out.
There's a lot of people probably.
But there is a lot of people that do. And it's easy, if you're against the industry, well, let's say you're on the side of the economy that builds things. No matter what it is, you're putting in motion processes that have a footprint. If you want to build cell phones, if you want to build wind turbines, you're putting in motion a process which has a footprint, which means you need raw materials, which means you need mines, you need transportation for those minerals, you need processing for them, you need to hire people that are going to work there, that are going to have their own footprint and their own kids, and it's just this web. And as soon as you put any of those in motion, if you're a builder of things we use in society, you're creating a footprint of something. If we're going to get binary about good and bad, if we're going to say this group is good and this group is bad, anybody that's building something is by definition bad because they're creating an environmental footprint. But they're building it to meet the needs of the whole population, which is what they want. The creators of things are automatically sort of in one bad camp because they're the ones that go seek approval for a new mine or for a pipeline or whatever else.
Not even that, it could be Tesla or some green company, right?
Exactly. It could be the greenest company out there, and you have a footprint, and so you're part of the problem in quotation marks, but you're also part of the solution in quotation marks for the world that wants those products. So it's not a dichotomy to say you create something that has an environmental footprint and you're an environmentalist. You can be both.
Exactly.
Farmers you can view them in one lens as being very hard on the environment, but at the same time, no one cares as much about the environment as a farmer. They really do care. They may spray chemicals on every square meter of their land, but they care about the environment.
Yeah.
It's their livelihood.
I came across the term the other day. It's the environmentalism versus conservationism. Environmentalism often is associated with the crazy ideologues on the far end of the spectrum versus conservationalism, which is more of a rational understanding that you have to build and take care of people, but at the same time, you think about the environment too. So there's a lot of people maybe fall into the conservationist side of things versus extreme ideologues in the environmental camp. It was something I hadn't really thought of before.
And you're right, and that makes total sense. And that why isn't the phrase of a conservationist more prevalent? Because that's what we should aim for, right? That should be the ideal, if you ask me, rather than, and there's nothing wrong with being an environmentalist per se in the exact meaning, the literal meaning of the word, but because it brings such baggage with it. So that maybe that's part of the debate that needs to be reframed too. We need to rethink of how we label people.
How hard is it to change our current energy system? If you want to change it tomorrow.
If you want to change it tomorrow, it's not going to happen. And I think where people get thrown off is that it is relatively easy to change 5% of it, and it's much, much harder to change 10% of it. To change 25% of it, it's an upward sloping curve. And then if you want to get to 70 or 80 or 90%, it's virtually impossible within any foreseeable time frame.
And when we say energy, we mean traditional oil and gas.
Yeah, just where we get our energy from or how we consume it. If you look at, if you pick any example, if you pick wind and solar, there's an awful lot of wind and solar installations in the world. They're everywhere. You drive around the States or you see pictures of Germany or China, or it's not hard to find pictures of massive installations. They're meeting a small fraction of the world's energy needs, 3% perhaps or something. But if you want to get to 10%, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't just mean you add more solar panels. It means you have to redo the electrical grid because it doesn't work. It's not built for that. It's built for the electrical grid around the world was largely built 50 to 100 years ago. And in the West, it was built 100 years ago. Very outdated in some senses, but it's based on big nodules that create power, and they pump them in a single direction to end users, and that infrastructure has been built over many decades, And a lot of the equipment in it is very, very old. If you want to have, let's say in a given jurisdiction, you have 2 or 3 or 5 main power sites, and they've been distributing that power through dams or coal-fired power stations or whatever they were, and they've been working that way for 80 years, and now you want to convert it to having 1,000 small generating sites. How does that work? Works okay if you're talking about a fraction of the grid, but if you want to change 50% of the grid, it's like a totally different. No one's ever actually tried it before. To actually reconfigure an electrical grid, talk to grid experts for my book. One guy in particular that used to work for General Electric, he says that he doesn't believe that even the grid operators themselves know what it would take to convert to a truly smart grid, not just in terms of cost, the scope of the project. If you look at the issue at all, you run into these examples relentlessly about, well, California, for example, PG&E went bankrupt because of the fires in California, and the fires were blamed on climate change, when in most of the fires, and the ones that caused all the damage, were caused by sagging power lines, which had been maintained, banging against trees that had been not trimmed properly. The magnitude of fixing that problem in California alone after the fires, and the Utilities Commission ordered PG&E to clear all the brush in danger spots, and PG&E said it would have cost them $150 billion to do it in the time frame that was instructed, which is not going to happen. PG&E sent out some people to examine their grid, some of their own people, and they couldn't determine the age of some of the grid components, and they sent out a consulting firm who came back and said, we can't tell either. So there are parts of the grid that are so old, corroded and whatever else, and in need of repair. And this is just California, and California is a pretty green place. Yep. And you take that all over the world. To upgrade the grid to make it function properly, to make it safe, take California, for example, to clear all the trees underneath, which meet resistance from environmental groups. They don't want those trees cut. So that's another hurdle. You're facing protesters when you go to cut trees down, which is why California is now just simply shutting down power to certain regions when there's too high wind. So back to your original question, how hard is it? I don't think anybody understands the challenges at all. Right. Even though there are a lot of people out there that tell them that they do. You can find reports on the web that'll say we can do it in 15 years and it's going to cost X trillion dollars. I think those are just purely academic exercises that have no grounds in reality.
Even if you wanted to change tomorrow, and we're not being pessimistic, it's not to say that you don't want to change.
Exactly. There's outside of the fact that it might put a lot of people out of work. A lot of people would say it would be a great thing for the earth if we could go all solar,
probably,
and move and switch over, or whatever. But it just doesn't work that way. And Germany's the best example. They're more advanced than anyone. They've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on wind and solar. Now they're facing huge resistance from their population they're saying, we don't want any more windmill farms. We've got plenty of those.
I saw your tweet about that. Wasn't that yesterday?
Yeah. And it was just a study that paints talking there too about the cost of going exponential as you try and get from 60 to 70 to 80 to 90% renewable. And it gets into the trillions of dollars, which is bigger than the economy of Germany alone. That's even if you could do it. They're having resistance from citizens, and they still rely for, I think it's 25% of their power comes from coal. They're trying to expand a big coal mine in Germany because they need the coal. That's just a function of reality. Like you can have all of the wind and solar you want, but they're intermittent power, and you still need a backup power supply. So Germany's hitting a wall, and their emissions have flatlined over the past 10 or 15 years. All of that money, all of that effort, all of that expense to society and the reconfiguring, and they've made no dent in their emissions. Right. It's not to discourage them from doing that, but if you take one of the richest countries in the world with that kind of will to make that change, and that's the kind of progress they made, how is anybody else in the world going to do it? The U.S. has been more successful than anyone, actually, of the major economies in lowering their emissions. And they've done it by switching from coal to natural gas. And one of the reasons for that is because it's so cheap, because of the shale revolution in the United States, natural gas is. That's switching from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel, so which opponents aren't happy with either. But it works. And then again, that's shaving some off the emissions tab. But if you want to go from saving 10% to saving 50%, it's uncharted waters. People don't understand the scale and the scope of it.
Right. Here we are sitting in the, quote, capital of the oil patch of Canada with someone who's worked in the industry for a long time and is a significant role in an energy company now. Even you're saying it would be great if we could flip a switch to a better version of energy, but we can't.
We just can't. I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have about petroleum sectors. They think that we just love oil so much that we think it's better than anything else, but it's not true. I think it's more of a pragmatic realization that there is no alternative to it right now. It's like a fundamental human condition. You can ask any citizen you want in North America, would you like to get rid of world hunger tomorrow? Or would you like to get rid of malnutrition tomorrow? And everyone would say yes. Everyone at the same time would say that that's not going to happen tomorrow. And everybody kind of have this realization, and we work with it and we live with it. And it's the same thing with hydrocarbon-based economy. It's like, it doesn't matter what you want or how scared you are about climate change. It's not going to happen. And applying more and more force, and especially trying to cut off the source of hydrocarbons, it's like the war on drugs. It just doesn't work.
Right.
You have to tackle demand. You have to eliminate demand, and then the supply dries up. But you do not kill demand by killing supply. It just doesn't work that way.
Exactly. I think that's where a lot of the hypocrisy comes from.
Right.
Also, you look at a lot of those climate change protesters driving to the site where they're protesting in an SUV, or there was that one picture of the lady at the Shell, the tanker, in a plastic kayak.
It just goes on and on and on. The hypocrisy of the climate groups flying around the world to hold climate summits in Brazil and Chile and Poland and wherever they feel like it. They all fly there, and then they all complain about what we're doing to the planet. So yeah.
Speaking of coal, I read that China builds or is in the process of building hundreds of coal plants a year. We shut ours down, but they build more.
But by a factor of 100 probably compared to what we shut down. So
how does that work?
Well, and I think that then China is also lauded as a pioneer of renewable energy because they're going flat out on renewable energy. And they had some of the most aggressive electric vehicle adoption practices, which they've since rolled back because apparently they can't afford them. But China and India are both good examples of how you want to look at it, how you can look at the same problem and see two totally different facets to it. Both of those countries are doing fantastic work in the world of renewables. They're putting in lots of solar installations. They're encouraging people to go electric. They're using wind and solar. But at the same time, their coal usage is increasing too. India forecasts their coal consumption will double by 2040. China is, like you say, building coal-fired power plants. They're growing so fast, they need all types of energy. And even on the petroleum side, you couldn't say we want you to rely on petroleum only because that doesn't cut it. They need everything. They're consuming coal, oil, natural gas. I'm not sure about nuclear, but wind, solar, all of the above, because you have so many billions of people and their energy consumption, they're trying to get off the ground. Like there's a Reuters article about water in India. There's 190 million people in India that don't have access to clean drinking water. So what's their priority? Is it lowering their CO2 emissions, or would those 190 people, which is what, 5 Canadas?
Yeah.
They want water, and never mind the other things that we take for granted. They want to go shopping, and they want to go see the world too, and they want basic necessities, and they want air conditioners, and so wind and solar is not going to provide that, and neither will petroleum by itself. They need all sorts of energy. So China is trying to keep their population fed, clothed, heated, employed, and it takes all sorts of energy. Coal is just one of them.
So what price do you think Canadians are paying for this kind of symbolic gesture towards the climate that we're doing right now?
I think it's a huge price, and I think we're strangling ourselves. Again, there's two ways to look at that. There's the climate activist view that says, well, we have to do it because we have to set the example that people
that's what it is, right?
Look to us. Yeah.
Because we're David and Goliath.
Yeah, that's right.
When you compare ourselves to China.
And I'm not sure their entire thought process, but I know part of what they view as, I think there's an underlying view that people will want to emulate what we do in the West, which is one of the reasons that Teslas are the cool car, and they're promoted as a cool. I think Tesla will never be allowed to fail as a company, no matter how bad their financials are. Symbolism, exactly. And they're like the Apple of cars. And if you look at electric vehicle sales statistics, there's Tesla, and they dominate, and then there's everyone else, and they sell almost nothing. It's minuscule.
It's almost a brand.
It is. It's like an Apple, and it's people line up to buy Tesla, and there can be 10 other models sitting right beside them, and some of them are fantastic models. Like there's a new Audi e-tron that came out in the spring. A Tesla Model 3, for example, sells something like 10 or 20,000 a month, or even a Model S sells a couple thousand a month, and Audi e-tron sells about 600 to 800 a month. Not even comparable, and it's way cheaper than a Tesla Model S. Yeah. Jaguar came out with a highly regarded, sporty electric vehicle called the I-Pace, and it sells about half of what the e-tron does. It sells a couple hundred a month in the United States. No company would keep them alive except their electric vehicles.
So what price do you think the average Canadian is paying for that?
Idea seems to be that if we make North America these symbolic figureheads, that everyone will follow that lead, and then that's how you'll make the world green. So they're saying, like, you can't chastise India and China without doing everything we can in our power to lower our emissions. And India and China say the same thing. They said, you're the ones that created this problem. You're like, we're just getting off the ground. Don't hold us accountable. You're the ones that have been spewing out hydrocarbons for 200 years, and you're fabulously wealthy, and you have your cake and you want to eat it too. Mm-hmm. And we just want to get some cake. Mm-hmm. I think we pay a huge price for that, and I don't see any will to change that. I think people are the activist movement is fine with Canada having some sacrifice like that. It looks like a lot of the people that produce things for a living are not happy with it. So, and the general population isn't either. The general population does not want to spend money to fight climate change. They might say they do. There was polls in both Canada and the United States last summer, and the results were almost the same. They asked citizens how concerned they are about climate change, and the majority said either concerned or very concerned. It was like 70 to 80% in each country. The follow-up question was, and how much are you willing to spend to do something about it? And the answer flipped on its head, and it was the majority would spend almost nothing. Something like 90% would not spend $500 a year. In Canada, at least, more than half of the population wouldn't spend $100 a year. They're extremely concerned about something, but they're willing to do almost nothing about it. That's the dichotomy that we're in. And you say, what price is Canada paying? We're paying a huge price when we won't acknowledge that reality, that it's not getting us anywhere.
Do you think it's a vocal minority from
Yes.
environmentalists?
Yes, and it's like an industry now, and there are a lot of people that are employed in the climate industry. If you go to any website of any, pick one, Eco-Justice, Stand.Earth, Greenpeace, and there are dozens and dozens of them. Just go to their website, go to their staff page. You'll see every organization has 10, 20, 30, 50 people, and they're employed, and they do nothing but pump these messages out into the media sphere. That's their job. They have no other reason. They don't create things. They don't make people's lives better. They don't feed anyone. They don't heat anyone. They don't provide clothes. Do that on their hobbies, but their job is to push that message.
Do you think a lot of the funding comes from wealthy billionaires in the States?
Oh yeah, I do.
Is that true?
Well, as far as you can trace it, I mean, you can look at a lot of their websites and you'll see that they're funded by the Rockefeller Foundation or I can't remember some of the names, the Oak Foundation or
Patagonia, I think.
Patagonia, yeah, they give a lot of their money. Michael Bloomberg, who's running for the Democratic candidacy in the U.S., he's pumped $500 million of his own money into grassroots climate change activism, right, which means opposing fossil fuels. And he makes no bones about that. And he controls the media too, which it's not a fair fight in a sense to see petroleum companies being the underdog or being...
Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy. And a lot of people can't wrap their head around that. They say, well, there's no way that the big oil is on its knees from this other opponent, but it's true. And it's big oil for decades, got everything done that not just that it wanted, but big oil developed oil deposits around the world at the request of governments. Governments invited them in and gave them concessions to develop petroleum rights. That was the system until it wasn't about 10 years ago, and governments turned on big oil, and now governments are against them because it's politically advantageous to do so. And so that's why one of the reasons that big oil doesn't even control most of the world's oil reserves. That's a bit of a myth too. Like most of the world's oil reserves are owned by national oil companies. Yeah, the state oil companies, Russia, Middle East, Africa, even to some extent. And there's this myth out there that their big oil is just this dominant force that's just writing the script, and it's not even remotely true.
Right.
If it ever was, the only thing that was writing the script was relentless growth in demand for petroleum, and that's
The market.
The market. And it was, every country was worried about getting supply of petroleum. They weren't worried about slowing the development of it. They were worried about getting enough of it. And that was the case right up until not very long ago, until a few years ago. The relative glut of the U.S. shale boom has convinced everyone that there's infinite supplies, and now countries aren't worried about it because there seems to be a glut, but it's temporary.
Do you think that a lot of it's driven by identity politics? I'm a big fan of John Chouinard and Patagonia, like the way they grew their company slowly and privately. And a lot of people don't know that side of the story, but it almost seems like the outdoor identity and feeds it.
It does. And it's sad to see the crossbreeding there that Patagonia started off.
It's kind of a cool story.
It's a very cool story, but they've gone, I wouldn't say sideways lately. They've hooked up with like Bill McKibben now, who founded 350.org, who's one of the most militant climate activists there is out there. He wrote a blog on the Patagonia website a couple of months ago where he said, I'm very happy to see the climate change dialogue move past the environment to become a social justice issue.
Right.
So he's turning it into politics because he has political motivations.
Exactly.
Now Patagonia is now involved with the political movement.
Yes.
And that political movement is on the left side of the spectrum. Now, anyone that's on the right side of the spectrum, by default, must be against Patagonia.
Exactly.
Because Patagonia has sided with, and not just a climate activist, but a political activist.
Right.
And it's just a tragedy. And you see Patagonia doing a lot of good with their, they're a profit-seeking enterprise, but they have done a lot of good. They've done pioneering work with recycling, and they put money back, and it's fantastic. But personally, can I support Patagonia when they've aligned themselves with the political activists?
It's tough.
It's very tough. But my kids still like Patagonia. They wear Patagonia, and I don't have a problem with that. But great difficulty spending a nickel in there if I know it's going to help a political cause that I don't agree with.
Well, some of those causes are pretty fringe too.
Well, they really are. Well, Bill McKibben, and he's quite extreme in his desire to get rid of capitalism, which is a pretty strong position, especially in the United States. Is popular. There's more popularity for it in Europe, but it's growing in the States too. There's a generation that doesn't remember communism. There's a generation that does, and if you ever talk to someone that lived in a former communist country, they will give you an earful about what life was like and then how we should not take that for granted. But I saw a poll about how many young North Americans support the concept of communism, and it's just an epic tragedy that they're not taught what it was all about. And these people that are saying we have to get rid of capitalism because they're looking at the dark side of it, the negatives of an unfettered free market, which is true. We don't have space for that, or we shouldn't. But to allow those people that are purveying that message to say that the solution is to overthrow the capitalist system, like, that's not good.
That's
but
insane.
It is insane, but there you have Patagonia standing in the middle of it, right? And Patagonia said, we are on that side. They are. And so what do you do now?
It's identity politics.
Yeah. Take a company that does great work environmentally in the true sense of the word, in the conservationist sense of the word, and they've aligned themselves politically in a way that is creating a division now that didn't exist before and shouldn't exist. But there it is.
Do you know anyone, any companies, anyone other than yourself that have kind of take the middle ground or the pragmatic approach?
I think it's very hard because it's become so
political.
Political and emotionally charged that there are strong voices on both sides, but they look at the other one. And that's the tragedy of making it political, is that we've achieved sort of a détente between socialists and capitalists where we make it work. There's a tug of war in politics where a left-leaning government will get elected, then a right-leaning one. Basically, they're all centrist. I mean, Trump is extreme, but
pragmatic.
They're pragmatic. In Canada, the NDP and the Greens now talk strongly one way. But if they're actually in power, they don't act that differently than the Conservatives would.
Wow.
Really, they wouldn't. I mean, when Notley was in power, she did some things which were on the socialist side of it, as far as supporting unions and bumping wages and stuff. But she also supported pipelines, and she did a royalty review of the petroleum sector, which was not harmful at all. And the lines are really blurred. So a party to succeed has to be kind of centrist. But the climate narrative is forcing people into those extremes, and so it's just going to lead to a war is what it's going to do.
Well, it's unfortunate because the real issues get lost.
Right, and nobody's worrying about the environment anymore. Or I shouldn't say nobody, but it's getting pushed to the background because people are being forced to go to war with each other.
And then you get policies that go the other way, and they shut down all industry, and industry in Alberta suffers. So you get reactionary.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and it is real that people are losing their businesses, and they shouldn't, and their jobs, and they shouldn't, because why should Canadian workers, petroleum workers, be losing their job because of environmental concerns when the job is simply exported to another country?
Well,
when Shell made a big deal of going green by getting rid of their oil sands assets, they sold them all, and they received accolades in Europe, and everyone was like, yeah, you look at that, Shell's abandoning the oil sands, and it's symbolic and it's a big deal. And they took all that money and they invested it in Nigeria, which has no standards.
Right.
And they flare gas relentlessly, and from an environmental perspective, it was nonsensical.
So nobody wins.
Nobody wins, but from a messaging perspective, it was a victory for climate activists, because they showed that money was leaving the oil sands, and that's what they wanted for political purposes.
So that's the unfortunate thing, is that through the ideology of environmentalism versus pragmatic scientific approach, the average person pays the price.
Right. The average person pays the price, and the average person also gets those messages thrown at them that this is a good thing, that this is that was a victory for the environment, but it's just not.
What effects do you think that has on the overall economy when industry dries up? Because capital isn't coming into Alberta, so the coffee shop doesn't get customers coming in.
Excuse me. I don't think anybody's actually figured that out yet. And I think that I call it the, okay, you drive moment, or here's the keys. If you take someone let's take the Greens as a radical example. They talk a lot about how they would run the country. If you actually put them in power, what would they do? What would would they be able to carry through on their mandate? And I don't think that they would, because these parties that get to run, they can say whatever they want when they're campaigning, and then when you get in and you're in control of it, all of a sudden you have a lot more respect for those things that you're trying to kill. And that happened with Notley, who was seen at anti-pipeline rallies and that sort of thing, and she spoke out against whatever. But when she's in power, all of a sudden she realizes, oh, well, I guess I can't really kill off that sector, even though I may have said that was a good idea before, but now that I'm running it, now that I have to pay the bills, and it's like when a kid grows up, you can say whatever you want when you're an idealistic kid. Mm-hmm. When you're 40 and you got a mortgage and 2 kids, you'd say, well, maybe I'm not quite so idealistic anymore. Right. Maybe I need a paycheck. Trudeau is a bit the same with the Trans Mountain pipeline. I think he did burn up a lot of his political capital by buying that pipeline, because he was really raked over the coals in Europe, and the left-wing media said this guy is a total sellout. He's no friend of the environment. That's straight out of The Guardian in the UK, that what a disaster Trudeau is for the environment. And I'm sure he didn't like doing that, but as a leader of Canada, even he could realize, I got to do something. I can't let this just die, or this country's going to go up in flames. Now he's doing the absolute bare minimum, and I don't think he's being very effective at it. But I do think that we don't see that in Alberta here, but I think that symbolically around the world, him buying the Trans Mountain pipeline and proceeding with the expansion was seen as a very, very bad thing. I do think that burns him to no end, that he had to do that.
Right.
So
you have the government stepping in. I mean, that's not good either, right?
No, it's not. It's terrible.
So what kind of message does that send to the free market?
Even though it was, in one sense, it was a problem of their own making, there's countries in the world and there are circumstances in the world where if you need something built, you get it built. And that's just the way it goes. No one knows that better than his father, who was ruling Canada when the FLQ crisis happened in the 70s, and he declared martial law in Quebec. And the media went after Trudeau Sr. and said, you can't do that. And he famously said, just watch me. Trudeau Jr. could do that with a pipeline, and he could say, I'm going to build one and just watch me, because this is in the national interest and it's going to happen in 2020 or whatever the schedule is. He could do that, but he chooses not.
Without getting too political, at the end of the day, it's about the energy industry and a lot of the misconceptions, and taking a pragmatic view, which a lot of people just aren't doing. Politics aside.
Right. Or they take too pragmatic of a view and they just look to the next election, but yeah.
Right. I mean, it just seems that, or they tie it into their own identity with their politics. And so
it's an easy sell if you go to the average citizen and say, would you rather get all your electrical needs from the sun or from dirty old oil? People don't know about energy. They're going they'll always vote for the sun. It's a no-brainer.
Right.
But the world doesn't work that way.
Do you think the fossil fuel, quote unquote, industry is become a scapegoat?
Yeah, for the climate change thing, I absolutely do. And that you see that relentlessly where they talk about one of the key messages of the climate activists is how much to the carbon in the atmosphere has been generated by a handful of companies. They have a statistic like that 100 companies have generated 70% of the CO2 and man-made CO2 in the atmosphere. Yeah. They take a company's total oil production over its history, and then they say how much carbon is in there, and then they hang that on the company, but there's not a word about the consumer there. How many lives did those fossil fuels enable? How many people wouldn't be here without those fossil fuels?
Right.
The people that are protesting wouldn't be here because we wouldn't have 7 billion people without those fossil fuels. So how do you, when you just want to look at that one side of the argument, it's the blind man and the elephant. It's like they're choosing one small aspect of it and focusing on that and extrapolating these horrors out of it, totally ignoring the benefits that came from it.
The blind man and the elephant being the guy who touches the tusk of an elephant.
Yeah, that's the old Indian fable or whatever. There's 7 men standing around an elephant and they're all describing what the animal looks like just based on what they're feeling. And everyone has something different. And they swear that that's what an elephant is like.
I mean, when you look at other industries, for instance, the shoe industry or the cement industry, nobody ever talks about those industries.
No, and the one that's making the news in a very minor way is how Quebec just authorized a new cement plant in Quebec that bypassed any environmental review. It's being supported even by the government, and yet cement production is one of the biggest polluters. Yeah. Greenhouse gas polluters, and there's fine because it's in Quebec. It's just another example of the hypocrisy that you just unfathomable out here.
Do you know the Lafarge plant that's on the edge of the park as you drive towards Banff?
Right.
Can you imagine that was an oil well?
Oh, right. Yes. Mm-hmm.
How do they get away with building cement plant there and nobody talks about it?
Yeah, it'd be a non-starter.
It's almost a symbol, right?
Yeah,
That's what it's become. So when do you think that transition kind of started then? In the 2000s?
I mean, an anti-fossil fuel thing? Yeah, I think it was in the 2000s. I think it's probably the early 2000s when climate change narrative became more prevalent and people became sincerely more concerned about climate change, what it could mean. I think it really took off when the activist side and the political side realized that they could use that as an umbrella to do whatever they wanted under. I think for Canada, it really got ugly when James Hansen and a couple other people labeled the price of oil had been in the $10 to $20 range forever up until 1999 or 2000, and then it went on a march up to $100 or $140 a barrel. And that increase in oil prices led to development of deposits that had never been developed before, primarily the oil sands, but others in the US and around the world too. But the oil sands are so huge. Activists in the States, they looked at the oil sands and they quite famously said that they called it a carbon bomb, saying if all of the oil in the oil sands was consumed, it would by itself increase the world's temperature by 0.3 degrees Celsius. So I think that was just like one of these key messages that just resonated around the world. We must stop the oil sands, because that alone could fry the planet. And those are the phrases that they used. James Hansen and forget the other guy that was promoting it. So they just dialed right in on the oil sands. That must be stopped, that we cannot allow the development of the oil sands. They conveniently skipped over the fact that what they were talking about when they said burning all the oil in the oil sands was all 1.8 trillion barrels, which is in place. Of those 1.8 trillion barrels in place, only about 10% of that is considered recoverable. 170 billion barrels is considered recoverable. So that's actually less than 10%. But they didn't acknowledge that. They said they referred to the 1.8 trillion number, and it scared everybody. And that was their goal, was to scare everybody when there's no grounds for it. And even the 170 billion barrels at today's production rates, it would take a couple hundred years to produce all of that.
Right.
And even if you doubled it, it would take almost 100 years to produce what's considered recoverable. So it's a total bogeyman that they created just to help with their messaging and to landlock the oil sands. And I think that they were... So I think from Canada's perspective, that's when it really took off. That was 2004 or 2006 or something, when that messaging started to take off, that the oil sands must be stopped at all costs or the planet is doomed, which is sort of a singularly silly way of looking at it, because it is one deposit. There are huge deposits all over the world. Taken in totality, it is huge, but nobody applies that same metric to any other oil reservoir in the world. Like, they don't say if you burn every barrel of oil in Gawar, it'll destroy the planet.
Or the Eagleford.
Or Eagleford, Vaca Muerta in Argentina, or the Permian, or big Russian fields. Like no one applies that yardstick to it, but they did to Canada, and Canada let it happen. That was part of my messaging woes. I watched this unfold, and it's like, this is absurd. Like they're talking about a technical impossibility. There's no one out there that would ever consider all of the oil sands oil to be combustible. It just could not happen. Mm-hmm. Spread over 140,000 square kilometers, the oil sands. How would you ever dig all of that up? Yeah. But no one challenged it, and it just became a truth.
There's a few large petroleum interests in Canada, I mean, large companies or wealthy individuals. Do you think it's partly due to the fact that nobody's stuck up, no lobbying efforts in that sense, versus in the States where there are some powerful oil interests?
That's a good question. Like, a lot of the powerful money just left Canada, right. and a lot of the powerful money in the U.S. is more homegrown. That's their headquarters. They just haven't faced the resistance that we have yet. It's starting to build there. I think it happened very quickly for Canada's petroleum sector. We weren't ready for it, and we're very easy to landlock. Doesn't take very much to block access to the West Coast or going east. It took very little for both oil and natural gas. Whereas the United States, their big oil deposit is right along the Gulf Coast. So they could build all the pipelines they want in Texas, which is a friendly jurisdiction. So the Permian could develop like crazy. Right. Even the Marcellus, the big natural gas deposit in the Northeast U.S., it can't make its way to the eastern seaboard of U.S., which is very close, because New York won't allow pipelines to go across the state. But it is finding a home by flowing south to the Gulf Coast and supplying other parts of North. And it goes around. It does make its way to the southern part of the U.S. along the coast too. They've found these huge deposits, and they just went ahead and developed them, and they found markets for them. Mm-hmm. They developed export terminals, all sorts of export terminals for both oil and natural gas now. Canada can't get one off the ground. There's a few things that hobbled Canada. One was the speed of it. One was the ease with which activists could block any progress. And then there was the lack of the government will. So,
do you think we're somehow to blame for that?
I mean, we as a country, or we as an industry?
There's no billionaire lobby effort from the guys at the top, for instance.
Well, I think that the lobby effort has changed too, because we don't like to lobby.
Like, where are those guys? Like, they're not out there fighting.
Well, it's hard to lobby government, like at the federal level, when you have a prime minister with an environment minister at his elbow declaring a climate emergency.
Right. But do you think there's some blame to place on the energy industry itself?
Oh, I think there's a huge blame to be placed for not telling its story better, not getting ahead of this. Yeah, it is a blame. They just didn't roll with the times as quickly as the opponents did. I think that their messaging didn't catch. They didn't catch up. By the time that they stopped treating it as a joke, by the time that they stopped treating social media as a joke, it was their default platforms around the world. Industry didn't understand like the power of imagery or visuals or the simple things like a picture of an oil-covered duck. How many hundreds of news releases and how much PR material is invalidated by one picture of that? You can say our operations are safe till you're blue in the face, and they might be safe. That all that gets trumped by one image of a spill in a creek or something. Mm-hmm. And that's what the whole world sees, and that's what the whole world believes. Mm-hmm. That the industry allowed themselves to be boxed into a position where their messaging is that perfection is required, because if you have one imperfection and somebody gets a picture of it, that invalidates your message. We needed to focus not just saying our operations unsafe, but showing people exactly that, making it literal for them, making it visible for them, mm-hmm. making them understand what it means to have safe operations, because they are safe operations. But when you just say, trust us because we're safe, that doesn't work, because inevitably there will be an incident. It's like a car company can't say, trust us because our cars aren't designed to get in accidents, so we don't think they will. But then one does, then that means, does that make you wrong? Not necessarily, but it's a very poor choice of how you choose to market yourself. There are ways to do it. I mean, if you take cars, for example, like Volvo has promoted themselves as the safe car company, and they put out a goal saying we want to have no fatalities in our cars by a certain year. And that made headlines around the world. And it's like, whoa, that's just fantastic. Yeah. But does that mean that other car companies don't care about that? It's like, no, they stake that ground, and they're the safe car company, and they probably are safer statistically than most car most other cars, but I'm sure there are some Mercedes and BMWs and whatever else that are just as safe as a Volvo, but people think of Volvo as the safe car company. And so why doesn't the world think of the petroleum sector as providing the fuel that provides our world? Why don't they think of that? Because we chose not to tell that story, failed to. But we could have just as easily done that.
So how do we move forward as Canadians?
There are many slices to that statement. How do we move forward as Canadians on the climate front? I think we would have to define these bit by bit. What do we want to do climate-wise? We're being told what we need to do, but what's realistic? And I think we need to, it sounds trite to say have a dialogue, but I think people need to understand what's possible and what isn't. And I think that's the starting point. And that's what I write about, and that's what my book is about, is just try and bring that to the fore, say what is possible. We know what we want. We want to have a cleaner environment. Everybody wants that. And one side wants us to move off fossil fuels aggressively, and the other side says you can't. And we need to have a structure where we can have that conversation that says, okay, we understand that, but what does it mean and what's real, rather than just saying we can do it, so we're going to do it, without taking into account the fact that people won't give up their lifestyle, for example. We need to have some sort of a forum where the decision makers say, here's where we want to get to, but what is real and what isn't, and what's feasible and what isn't. And we don't have that yet. We just have, it does no one any good to have a politician say we're in a climate emergency and then not act like it. You can't have a leader that says that and then he flies all over the place on vacations all over the world. You create this polarization, and I'm not just singling out Trudeau or any one person, but to have that dialogue, there has to be some sincerity and some understanding of both sides. And I don't mean to equate the sides. I think the climate activist side has been far more aggressive at trying to snuff out the petroleum sector. But like you said, at the same time, there are certain elements of the industry side that haven't gone out of the way to help themselves either. So
how do you frame it so that it's not a business right-leaning argument versus the left and the climate?
That's the biggest challenge, because a lot of the forces are pushing it into that direction. So so you have to push back against all of those forces, and it's a huge challenge. But the way that I do it is I make a very clear distinction between true environmentalists, or conservationists, as you call them, which is a great word, and the climate change movement. And
crazy
one is
ideologues.
political. Yeah, exactly. And the ideologues, which attract followers and opponents because that's their nature. They're just divisive. And then that's in one camp. And actually they're all, both sides are in that same camp. And then you have the people that are truly concerned about the environment and want to do something with given the constraints that we all want to live in a certain way. And I call that group the Mother Earth News. And there's a show on TV that I saw. It's on PBS in the US. It's called Growing a Greener Earth. I thought it was kind of interesting. It's dedicated to people who grow their own vegetables, and they're organic kind of people. And their sponsors for their show are Subaru, some organic fertilizer place, some egg farm, but they don't shun petroleum like sponsored by Subaru, and they're happy with that because that's just a fact of life. Or Kubota tractors, they're sponsored by Kubota tractors. That's a fact of life in agriculture. You need these things, but you can minimize your footprint, as opposed to in the other camp where people are fighting about, we need to stop doing this right now. The other one is saying, well, you're a commie and whatever else, and pit of fighting that's not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so we need to park all of that and focus on the people that can do something about, and say, we're going to live a certain lifestyle, and how do we do it the best way we can?
Right. So frame it more as rational.
Yes, rational, and just focus on efficiency, there's trite things: reduce, reuse, recycle. Those should be the mantras. Those should be the guiding lights. And we should stop any talk about climate change, because we need to focus on reducing our footprint. And that means pollution, and getting rid of plastic in the ocean is just as important as reducing CO2 or whatever else. This is a holistic thing. Instead of creating a new mine in wherever, maybe we need to have a recycling tax on the gold or whatever, palladium or whatever it is that's in that mine is being created for. And if enough exists in the world, but we're just not recycling it properly, we should incentivize the system so that it does recycle it properly. And then we don't need the new mine. And then there saves some environmental footprint. I think there are ways to rethink how we tackle this challenge. So
there are ways to do it.
I think so, yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. I really appreciate you sitting down, Terry.
My pleasure.
It's been a long day. It's a Monday, so
yeah,
we'll leave it at that. The pragmatic viewpoint on energy and the environment. Thank you. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked what you heard, head over to rosebros.ca where we will have upcoming episodes. You can also find our coffee and chocolate there, where we plant one tree for every bag or bar sold through our partnership with One Tree Planted, a non-for-profit organization focused on global reforestation. Otherwise, until next time, happy coffee drinking.